A my tady máme na programu jednoho zahraničního hosta a tady právě nám do toho vstoupil covid, že jsme museli teď na poslední chvíli zrušit letenku, ale my jsme se s ním poprali. Takže jedná se o Stricklera a nám se podařilo jeho přednášku během víkendu předtočit, zhruba otitulkovat a budete mít přes online šanci se ho vyptat na dotazy, které tady přeložíme. Takže já bych rád představil. Strickler je mezinárodně uznávaný agronom, agroekolog a konzultant s více než 30letou praxí. Dělal poradenství nejen v různých regionech USA, ale i tady poblíž v Maďarsku. Sám si od roku 1997 provozuje vlastní hospodářství, takže má i vlastní zkušenosti na svém pozemku, který opečovává. Celou přednášku máme, ta je trochu delší než to, co vám teď tady pustíme. Tu budete mít šanci prohlédnout si v klidu doma, protože přece jenom je to jako hutné intenzivní, tak všichni dostanete do e-mailu odkazy a můžete si to znovu pustit, i s titulkami v klidu si to projít, abyste tady nebyli pod tlakem. Takže posledních 10 minut je taková jakože perlička, kterou si musíte pustit až doma. Takže nebojte, o nic nepřijdete. A jak říkám, na konci, až skončí toto video, budete mít šanci pokládat otázky. Já bych možná už v tuto chvíli poprosil o záznam Dale Stricklera.
Hi, I'm Dale Strickler from the United States. I really want to apologize for being unable to meet you and to interact with you because of my illness. I hope that this video is at least a partial substitute for my attendance. I look forward to your questions at the end. I'm eager to interact and discuss all the concepts that I discuss in this video with you. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you enjoy the conference and that you are able to use the information that you get from this to make a better life and a much more profitable life for yourself. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you about successfully transitioning to regenerative agriculture. And any transition in agriculture can be really scary, especially if your living depends on a successful outcome with what you do. And there's a lot of fear anytime you make a change. Will I lose money? Will people ridicule me? Will I become a social outcast? Change is always scary if your livelihood depends on a good outcome. But if you understand the principles behind what makes crops grow, how our practices in the past have satisfied those principles of crop growth, and how you can change your system to satisfy those principles, then you can anticipate what can possibly go wrong, and you can improve the odds of a favorable outcome in your favor. So a little bit about me. The red star indicates where I'm from, right in the middle of the United States, in Kansas. I'm from a small town there, a population of about 300. Our normal temperature range, we get as cold as -20. In the wintertime, we get as warm as 40 Celsius in the summertime. We have gotten as hot as 48 in the summertime and as cold as -29. Our rainfall averages about 800 millimeters. So, and you might say, well, regenerative agriculture works where you are, but it won't work where I am. Regenerative agriculture works everywhere. It works in Africa, it works in Asia, it works in South America, North America, and yes, in Europe. And how do I know that it works? How do I know that regenerative agriculture works everywhere? Because nature works everywhere. The principles of regenerative agriculture are based on the principles of nature. We spend so much money with unsuccessful outcomes trying to fight nature. If we work with nature, we improve our odds of a favorable outcome because nature works everywhere. The picture of these trees, these are the giant redwood trees of California on the west coast of the United States. They are 100 meters tall. This soil has never been tilled. No plowing, it's never been fertilized, no herbicide, no insecticide, no intervention by humans at all. 100-meter tall growth. Nature works everywhere. If nature can do that without our help, maybe we should learn from nature. So let's learn what makes plants grow more. There are certain principles that work all around the world. Sunlight and water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other mineral nutrients. Carbon dioxide for the leaves for photosynthesis, and oxygen to the roots. We often forget that plant roots need oxygen. So if any agricultural practice increases yield, it's because it did one of two things. It either increases the availability of those growth factors, or it decreases the loss of yield from weeds, diseases, or insect pests. So the bigger question is, will regenerative agriculture make you more money? So to answer that question, I have other questions. Do you spend more money now on fertilizer, insect control, and weed control than you want to? And will an increase in soil moisture, more fertility in your soil, deeper roots, and fewer weeds and insect pests give you more crop yield? If you answered yes to those two questions, then regenerative agriculture can make you more money. So what do we not do in regenerative agriculture? We eliminate the two most destructive agricultural practices, tillage and fallow. Now, tillage has been a mainstay of agriculture, one of the main practices of agriculture for thousands of years. If tillage is so bad, why have we continued to do it for so long? Because tillage gives us the illusion of productivity. Thousands of years ago, when tillage first began, someone stirred the soil and there was an increase in plant growth, and they thought, this must be good. Why does tillage seem so often to increase crop yield? Because tillage oxidizes soil organic matter. It breaks it down, and that soil organic matter breaks down into carbon dioxide, which makes plants grow more, and mineral nutrients, which makes plants grow more. And you think, well, that's good. See, tillage makes plants grow better, and it does. But what's the problem? The problem is that every time you till, you have less soil organic matter than you did before you tilled. Each and every time, it breaks the organic matter down. And eventually, you get soil like this. I took this picture around Budapest, Hungary. No organic matter at all. It's just clay. 4,000 years of tillage has robbed this soil completely of organic matter. Now it's difficult to work and it doesn't produce good crops. You eventually run out of organic matter. Tillage is like using a credit card. It can improve your lifestyle today, but then the bill comes due. The other destructive practice is fallow. Fallow is the practice of growing nothing. Usually we put land in fallow with the idea of storing soil moisture for the next crop. We used to think that giving land a rest was a good thing. But that's not how it works. Fallow doesn't rest soil. It starves it. Soil is created from rock powder by the process of photosynthesis. Fallow starves soil. So in regenerative agriculture, we replace periods of fallow with cover crops. This picture is from France. Look at all those species of flowering plants, all the photosynthesis going on. This crop is as high as her shoulders. It's pumping sunlight below ground. The way cover crops feed soil is through photosynthesis. Sunlight, carbon dioxide are combined to form sugar. We used to think that plants made sugar only to feed themselves. But 25 to 50% of the sugar that plants produce in photosynthesis are leaked out of the roots as root exudates, and they feed soil microbes. And those soil microbes turn rock powder into soil. These root exudates, this liquid sugar, is the lifeblood of soil. So, why is that important? How do those cover crops make me money? Said, yes, I want better soil, but I need to have good crop yields. Look at this yield map. The farmer did everything exactly the same across the entire field. But you look at the yield map. Some parts of the field made 10 tons per hectare. Some parts of the field made 5 tons per hectare, and some made 1. What's the difference? What's the difference between the green areas and the red areas? The difference is that the green areas had good soil. What's the difference between good soil, like you see to the right of the screen, and bad soil, like you see in the left? The difference between good soil and bad soil is carbon, soil organic matter. That soil organic matter is the difference. These two soils, I collected these two soils across the road from each other. They were originally the same soil, but they've been farmed very differently for 20 years. How does regenerative agriculture, help plants grow? How does it help us make more money? More water availability, more mineral availability, fewer weeds, fewer pest insects, better soil oxygen content. Now, it is also important to realize these benefits take time. You often don't see these results the first year. It takes time to build these benefits because most of these benefits take place because of an increase in soil organic matter, soil carbon. So the most important step when you begin this transition into regenerative agriculture, when you have this increase of residue on the plant surface, you have more plant material, you need a proper planter. There's nothing really special about a no-till planter. It just has to be better because it has to cut through all this residue and place the seed. So the discs need to be sharp to cut instead of pressing this straw into the ground. It has to be heavy so it'll push down. It has to be strong so that it won't break under all this weight. But the biggest fear in regenerative agriculture, when someone makes this transition, when they're planting cover crops, they have a fear that this cover crop will use up all my moisture. It'll use all the soil water. And if you look at this point here at cover crop termination and at planting time, there is less moisture where the cover crop was used. Look at down here, 2009. First year. This is the first year cover crop. Yes, less moisture at planting, but look, it got a rain, and then after that rain, after that cover crop was killed, each and every rain, the cover crop field recovered faster. Why is that? As you can see in this photo, without the cover crop, rainfall runs off. With the cover crop, over here, rainfall soaks in. So each and every rain after you terminate that cover crop goes in the soil better. Also, once the moisture is in the soil, when you have complete coverage of that soil with crop residue, you have less evaporation of that soil moisture. It stays in the soil longer. Research in the U.S., close to where I live, 127 millimeters less evaporation in a year than with tilled fields. That's significant. Also, by selecting the right cover crops, like this radish, big, deep taproots, you can enable the next crop in your rotation to root deeper into the soil. Research in Maryland in the U.S. has shown that maize grown after a cover crop of radish rooted 0.4 meters deeper into the soil. 0.4, that can access about 30 millimeters more soil moisture throughout a growing season. But, like I said, you don't often see the complete benefits with just 1 year. If you keep going, if you have faith in the processes, if you have faith that nature works, and you continue the course. Look, this is year 5 of cover crops. Because of that greater efficiency at rainfall infiltration, that lower evaporation of soil moisture. Look, by year 5, there is more soil moisture all the year long where you have cover crop. Now you might say, well, there are times of the year I don't want more soil moisture. It'll be too muddy to plant. It'll be too muddy to harvest. Long-term, no-till soil, when you get high organic matter, that soil resists compaction. You can drive on it even if it's wet. You can plant seeds in it even when it's wet. You can harvest even when it's wet, and it doesn't harm the soil like it does in tilled soil. This is what we are used to. This is a tilled soil. And they tried to harvest when it was too wet. Truck got stuck. But this is better. First year no-till. 2 years no-till. Many years no-till. Hardly any tracks. The soil becomes firm, not hard, but firm. The next thing that you can use regenerative agriculture to improve your profits is to provide part of your nitrogen fertility with legumes. You can see the nodules on this. This is a nitrogen factory that operates on sunshine, operates for free. This is the sun hemp plant. This is a common cover crop during the summer. This cover crop was planted after the harvest of wheat, cowpeas, and sun hemp together. Not only provides cattle pasture, but also a tremendous amount of nitrogen. This particular crop contained 90 days after growth, after planting, 165 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. That's significant reduction in the amount of nitrogen needed for the next crop. This is a winter cover crop, crimson clover and winter barley, planted after the harvest of soybeans in the fall and growing prior to the planting of corn the next year. This is hairy vetch and cereal rye. This was planted in October after the harvest of another crop. Photo was taken on 2 June. 249 kilograms nitrogen per hectare. Planted maize, no nitrogen fertilizer needed. Another means of establishing cover crops is to do it even before the harvest of the previous crop. This used to be a very common agricultural practice. You can see the harvest is in process. The clover was seeded in the wintertime while the wheat crop was still growing, and at harvest, you're already capturing sunlight, you're already producing nitrogen. Another way that cover crops can increase your profitability is by adding income in the form of livestock. This was planted after wheat harvest. Many species in here. There's sunflowers, this is buckwheat, sorghums. There are legumes in here to make nitrogen, cowpeas. This is good for the soil. This feeds the soil below ground, feeds livestock above ground. Another benefit of having these livestock is a manure. Manure makes soil happy. It's hard to believe, but when all that plant material is processed through the rumen of a grazing animal, the manure that's deposited on that soil will create more soil organic matter than the decay of the plants that went into the animal would have. Grazing is a very beneficial process for the soil. Inside that rumen is controlled decay, intelligently guided decay. It creates a better soil improvement medium than the plants would have before the animal ate it. Another real benefit of regenerative agriculture is that oxygen can penetrate down into the soil. More oxygen in the soil means that roots can grow deeper. There's many mechanisms that you leave the root systems in place. You don't till them and chop those root systems. Earthworms create burrows in the soil. Soil microbes create aggregates, little round balls of soil around which oxygen can pass down deep into the soil. This picture I took in Hungary. This is well over a meter below the soil surface. And look, very, very heavy clay soil, very sticky. But look at this worm burrow, and the root of a cover crop is going down that worm burrow. The worm made a hole. The cover crop is exploiting that hole, making it bigger. And then when the cash crop is planted, the root system of that cash crop will go right down the same hole and root much, much deeper than it would have otherwise. How do you get more earthworms? You feed them. You feed them cover crops. This is taken in wheat stubble. So these two cover crops were planted after wheat was harvested, and then they counted the earthworms at the end of 2 rotations. Look at all the earthworms. Each and every earthworm will make it more and more possible for the crop to root deeper. And then fighting weeds. I don't know about you, we have some nasty weeds that we fight. How does regenerative agriculture help with weed control? Cover crops in particular have 3 mechanisms of weed control that can be amazingly effective. The first one is mulch, having a thick cover crop residue layer on the soil surface. Weed seeds, as you can tell by this chart, weed seeds are much smaller over here than crop seeds. The bigger the seed, the more energy is stored within the seed. And the deeper mulch that they are able to grow through. When you have a very thick mulch, and you can see the thicker the mulch, the fewer weeds are able to emerge. Corn, because it has a very large seed, can emerge from through very thick cover crop residue. Use mulch to help eliminate small-seeded weeds. Another mechanism is allelopathy. Allelopathy is when certain crops contain toxins that affect other crops. Most famous of these is rye. Rye has 3 chemical compounds that have been identified. They're very similar in chemical structure to the herbicide dicamba. Our worst weed problem is amaranth. Amaranth, very susceptible to these chemical compounds that are found in cereal rye. Another method is the exclusion of nitrogen. Weeds, like most plants, need nitrogen in order to grow. However, legume crops, peas, soy, lentils, faba, these make their own nitrogen. So if you use a cover crop prior to growing a legume crop, use a cover crop with a very high ability to take nitrogen out of the soil. See right here, the line, left of the line, cover crop was grown prior to soybeans. No cover crop over here. Look at all the weeds. There are virtually no weeds here. All the nitrogen that was in the soil was taken up by the cover crop, sequestered into the form of protein in the crop residue, now is unavailable for the weeds. But many grain crops require nitrogen. You can't use that strategy in front of every crop, but you can still use the same principle. This farmer is killing a cover crop with this roller crimper and planting maize in one operation at the same time. This hairy vetch cover crop contains a lot of nitrogen, but it's not in the form of nitrogen that weeds can use. Most weeds need nitrogen in the form of nitrate, NO3-. The nitrogen in this cover crop residue is in the form of protein. It's not available to the weeds or the crop until it breaks down. It has to die and decay. So there's a close-up look of the roller crimper used to kill cover crops without needing herbicide or tillage. So the way you provide, when you have that legume residue, the way you provide the needs of your crop, but not the weeds, is to place the fertilizer along the row and only next to the row so your crop can get it, but weeds can't. You do not want this situation. This will enable your weeds to grow. This one does not. And here's the results. This farmer is an organic farmer, no tillage, no herbicide, no fertilizer applied to this field. Only 10 liters of liquid fish per hectare right next to the row to provide the nitrogen needs of that crop until this hairy vetch residue breaks down. No weeds. Isn't this amazing? And then fighting insects. Another fear of cover crops is that all this residue on the surface will increase your insects in your field. That's often true. It does increase your insects. But one of the goals of regenerative agriculture is not to eliminate insects. We actually want more insects. But we want the insects that we have to be harmless insects. This cover crop mix is being grown by a potato farmer next to his potato field. Look at all the flowering species in this. There are peas and there's canola and mustards and all different kinds of flowering plants, vetches and peas, chickling vetch, all kinds of flowering plants in here. Very, very attractive to a large number of insects. You say, why do we want all these insects in our field? Because if you have harmless insects in your field, you bring in predators of insects, like these lady beetles. This is a syrphid fly. It has a larva that eats maggots, or eats aphids. This eats aphids. All of these insects eat aphids. This is the larva of a lady beetle, and it's eating all these aphids. One of the worst, this is the sugarcane aphid, one of the worst pests of sorghum in our country. The way we have learned to control sugarcane aphid. When we first had problems with sugarcane aphid, devastated sorghum crops. We had to spray twice with very expensive insecticide. And if you had to spray with insecticide, you were guaranteed to lose money. They were so expensive. Some farmers planted, instead of applying insecticide, they planted flowering plants within their field. Flowering plants, primarily buckwheat, attracted the lady beetles. The lady beetles build up their population by eating the pollen of the buckwheat. These larvae could live on buckwheat pollen. They build up a big population. When the aphids arrived, they migrate from southern states. When the aphids arrived, there was an army of these lady beetle larvae waiting, ready to eat them. No one, in my knowledge, that has used this approach has ever had to spray to control the sugarcane aphid. So the bottom line is that regenerative agriculture can make you more money. It can make you more crop yield. But it's not just about more crop yield or more money. It's about creating a better life and lifestyle for you and your family, for your community, for your country, for our species, and for our planet. We can return our farms, we can recreate gardens of Eden on all of our farms, where we work with nature in the manner that God intended us to. Thank you. I wish I could be there. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Tak, dámy a pánové, toto byl Dale Strickler ze záznamu, který pro nás stihnul vyrobit přes víkend, když se nemohl dostat kvůli covidu do letadla. Nicméně, Dale si teď přivstál, má 3 ráno, takže mu popřejte dobré ráno, za chvíli se tady ukáže, protože si s vámi opravdu chtěl popovídat. Jak jste slyšeli, je to akademický pracovník, je to vystudovaný agronom, má všechno to běžné dělání, dělal poradce na farmách, má svoji vlastní praxi zemědělskou a prostě regenerativní zemědělství se věnuje už 30 let a sbírá data i od všech ostatních a je to vlastně takový popularizátor. Takže on se snaží o to, aby všechny tyhle ty znalosti se co nejsnáze zpřístupnily ostatním zemědělcům a mimochodem napsal i nějaké knihy k tomu. Já bych teďkon, jak to bude probíhat následovně? Můžete se zvednout ruce, formulujte si otázku v češtině, řeknete ji do mikrofonu, já ji přeložím Daleovi a Dale bude povídat a pokud všechno dobře dopadne, tady za námi by se měly začít přepisovat titulky do češtiny. Zázrakem. Tak, takže připraveni na zázrak? Tak jo. Tak pokud teď přejdeme do angličtiny a prosím, můžete rovnou se hlásit s otázkami. Hi Dale, how are you doing? Good morning.
I'm great. Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us at 3 a.m. of your time. So we are ready for the Q&A session. Thank you for your talk. So before people stop being shy a little bit, I would ask you one question. What I hear quite a lot is from people who do organic, who we call it like ecological agriculture here quite often, beer. And yes. I heard like, hey, what's all the fuss around regenerative agriculture? Why are you just bringing new names for the same thing? That's what we all want to do, right? To regenerate nature, to do better things, to have better food. So, Dale, is there any difference between the regenerative and organic?
The biggest difference between regenerative and organic, at least in our country, I can only speak from our country, but organic agriculture here still heavily relies on tillage. Where organic agriculture eliminates the synthetic fertilizer, pesticides, and usually has a heavy reliance on using crop rotations, very sound crop rotations agronomically, wise crop rotations, but still relies heavily on tillage for weed control and for terminating cover crops. The difference with regenerative agriculture is that we try to eliminate the tillage as well. Now we will, because we are eliminating tillage, we do have some reliance on herbicides yet. But the goal is to eliminate both tillage and herbicides. So if that's helpful at all.
I think that's helpful. I would probably add that I see we are using the word here, orba, but I think in the English terms, the tillage is also like mechanical, any mechanical disruption of the soil. So even the shallow work with the soil. Is that correct, Dale?
Yes. Yes. We've had a number of trials.
Yeah.
Of course, seems like every farmer's biggest fear is drought. And we've found that even shallow tillage is very harmful to the infiltration of rainwater. And the vertical tillage, where we only use shallow discs, cuts our rate of rainfall infiltration in half. And in a drought situation, you really can't tolerate that. And that's compared to leaving all the mulch on the surface with no-till methods.
Okay, Dale, we're having a little bit of a trouble in our translation system, so I will skip into bilingual, I guess. Takže vidíte, dneska se vede spousta věcí, daří. Takže my jsme se tady bavili o té rozdílu jako hluboké orby. Já bych vlastně rád zdůraznil, že často se myslí tím nespracováváním jenom přestaneme dělat hlubokou orbu a versus to, co Dale, o čem se baví, tak je často ten no-till, je bez zpracování půdy, protože právě i to jakékoliv zpracování půdy vede k emisím a sice může krátkodobě zlepšit sakování do té doby, než se opět vytvoří krusta. Tak já se teď budu soustředit například. Zeptám se, jestli tady někdo máte nějakou otázku, se kterou bychom mohli pokračovat. Tamhle vidím vzadu ruku. Mikrofon, prosím, počkejte.
Dobrý den, já bych se chtěl Dejla zeptat, jestli má nějaké zkušenosti třeba s pěstováním brambor nebo víceletých plodin.
So Dale, the question is, do you have any experience with potatoes or more than annual plants? So not exactly perennial, I suppose. Víceletý, yeah. So
yes. Potatoes are particularly destructive to soil because of the necessity for tillage. You can't harvest potatoes without tillage. It's possible to plant them without tillage, but it's very, very difficult on a large scale. And so the goal of potatoes is not to do no-till. That's not possible. But the desire would be to repair the damage from tillage in the crop rotation in the years away from potatoes. Usually, because of disease issues, we'll only grow potatoes maybe once every 3 years or 4 years. And in the years away from potatoes, we'll dedicate to rebuilding soil. And one of the, usually potatoes are rotated with barley here. And people who have a very unsound crop rotation will do barley 1 year, potatoes the next, but the potatoes tend to get diseased. And the soil structure is poor in that rotation. They're lengthening the rotation out to include 1 year of livestock grazing on a mixed cover crop. Sedan grass, cowpeas, sun hemp, so forth. 10, 12 species in that cover crop mix. And then have a winter cover crop as well with rye, hairy vetch. Dedicate an entire year to grazing. Some people do include a perennial phase into the system, maybe 3 or 4 years of perennial pasture grasses and legumes, which is great at repairing soil structure.
Okay, thank you. So our translation is again up and running. Já poprosím o další otázku, tamhle vidím ruku. A potom budete na řadě vy, takže nejdřív tady. Tak.
Děkuji, já jsem chtěla navázat na ten komentář Dale ohledně využívání herbicidů v regenerativní zemědělství, což je případ i v České republice. A chtěla jsem se zeptat, do jaké míry má to srovnání v datech mezi regenerativním zemědělstvím a konvenčním zemědělstvím v USA. Děkuji.
A ještě jednou navázat na ten komentář o herbicidech a ta otázka tedy je?
Otázka je porovnání dat mezi využíváním herbicidů, to znamená množství herbicidů na hektar, regenerativní zemědělství versus konvenční zemědělství v USA.
Perfektní. So Dale, the question is around herbicides. What is the comparison how much herbicide per hectare or per acre, in your case, in the US is being used within the regenerative as opposed to the conventional? What is the comparison? How much herbicide used in conventional, how much herbicide used in a regenerative practice in the US?
It's much less. We found that herbicides only kill the weeds that are there, and if herbicides eliminated weeds, we would no longer have weeds after having used herbicides for 50 years. If tillage eliminated weeds, we would no longer have weeds because we've done 150, 200 years of tillage. We still have weeds, and our weeds are worse than ever. So we found that instead of using either tillage or herbicides as our primary weed control, we changed the conditions in the field so that weeds no longer thrive. We eliminate the things that, and in the talk, I address weed control quite a little bit later on in the talk, how we change the conditions in the field to eliminate weeds. And it's been very, very surprisingly effective, much more effective than I thought it would be before I tried it myself.
Thank you. Já tady možná ještě shrnu tu českou odpověď, takže vlastně říkal, kdyby jsme ty herbicidy, kdyby to fungovaly a ta orba, tak už žádné plevele nemáme, ale vlastně to, že to musíme pořád používat, je vidět, že to nefunguje. A takže vlastně mnohem raději se soustředí na to, aby ty podmínky na tom poli přizpůsoboval tak, aby tam ty plevele nevznikaly, než potom vůči nim muset zasahovat. Další otázka, poprosím.
Hello, I may try in English.
My to potřebujeme pro všechny tady v češtině, aby rozuměli.
Dobře. Nejdřív bych chtěla poděkovat za vaši prezentaci, protože jste skutečně skvělý řečník a bylo to opravdu zajímavé. Moje otázka je, jestli jste někdy vyzkoušel systém agrolesnického hospodaření a jaký na to případně máte názor. Agroforestry.
Mm-hmm. So Dale, first, thank you for your presentation. The lady is very happy with that. And the question for you is whether you've ever tried agroforestry, a system.
I love agroforestry. I think agroforestry is the ultimate agricultural land use. The book, when 35 years ago, when I was in college, I read a book called Tree Crops by J. Russell Smith. And it's discussed in my book. I have an entire chapter on agroforestry in that book. There are so many advantages to agroforestry. It gives us the ability to produce two crops on the same, a tree crop plus a pasture crop underneath. Of course, there's many different forms of agroforestry, but silvopasture is by far my favorite. The ability I have friends who are producing livestock, cattle pasture on the perennial grasses, and then in the fall they turn in pigs to harvest acorns and walnuts and other fruits, and it's a perfect system, very, very ecological.
Nějaké další otázky? Jestli tady je ruka, poprosím o mikrofon a já mezi tím dám doplňující na Dale. Jestli zda Dale má nějaké, jako vidí opravdové výsledky, nějakou ziskovost kolem tohohle agroforestry systému. So, Dale, please, I wonder, any of the agroforestry systems you've worked with, are there any that you think are really like profitable? Because from my uneducated perspective, it seems that sometimes it's more like a theme park, it's nice, but is there profit in agroforestry? Je tam zisk v agroforestry?
It depends on what you compare it to.
Okay.
So typically, we're comparing it to most of the time pasture alone. No trees, just the pasture. And so compared to the pasture alone, The trees, they're widely scattered. They don't reduce the yield of the pasture itself. And every year the trees grow a little more, a little more. Visited an agroforestry system years ago. When I first read about it in a magazine, it was black walnuts with pasture underneath. The black walnut crop at the time I visited was generating, it would be 2,000 US dollars per acre. So however that translates into your currency, just from the walnuts alone. Now, for the first 20 years, the only income was the pasture, the cattle grazing underneath. Yeah. But correct. That's what they were doing with the land anyhow. The walnuts took a while to get to production, but once they did, they were generating far more income than any grain crop would have. It was really a beautiful system. It was all perennials, good cash return, and no inputs, no fertilizer, no herbicides, no tillage, nothing, just harvest.
Perfect.
And I've seen all different kinds of permutations of that system, using pigs to harvest the crop, the nut crop or the fruit crop, sometimes salvaging whatever's left over, the apples with the worms in them, that can't be sold. So yeah, I think that is the ultimate agroecosystem.
Perfect. Já jen teď doplním, když to hlavě počítám, tak těch $2,000 na akr výnos jenom z těch černých ořechů, z těch ořešáků, co tam byly nad tou pastvinou, by se mělo rovnat něco přes 100 000 korun na hektar jako dodatečný bonus za to, že a pod tím se ještě něco děje, nějaká pastva, nějaký dobytek a tak dále. Poprosím o další otázku, která byla...
Áno, ja by som sa chcel opýtať pána Stricklera vzhľadom na tie skúsenosti, ktoré má, ako by podľa neho vyzeral taký najefektívnejší scenár prechodu z konvenčného na regeneratívne poľnohospodárstvo? Či by vedel niečo načrtnúť?
A máte nějaký příklad třeba, s jakými plodinami začínáte, nebo něco takového?
To by som nechal na ňo. Ide o tú efektivitu. Máte proste zničenú pôdu konvenčným dlhoročným poľnohospodárstvom a teraz sa chcete preniesť do toho nového prístupu. Aký je?
A velikost hospodářství, dejme tomu několik set hektarů?
Môže byť.
So Dale, the question is, imagine a few hundred hectares of a farm. What would be the best, the most efficient transition from conventional to the regenerative? What would you suggest to someone who wants to begin with this transition?
Learn everything you can. Talk to people. The greatest thing about conferences like this, and why I'm so disappointed I can't be there in person, is the friends that you make, the conversations outside of the sessions in the hallway. Seek people out who have already walked this path. They can give you the better advice than me. So make friends with the people around you right now. Find out who is in your area, who has conditions similar to you, and keep that conversation going. Email each other, get on Facebook, whatever social media, and stay in contact and ask each other questions, provide each other support. I think that is by far the best. But learn all you can. Read, get on YouTube. It is amazing, the information out there. Don't believe everything you hear on YouTube, but consider everything that you hear and weigh it. There are people that tell you that this doesn't work. It does work. because it works on natural principles. But learn, I think is my biggest. Learn not just from books, but from other farmers, and don't believe anyone when they say it can't be done around here.
Díky. Poprosíme otázku tahle.
Dobrý den. Já chci navázat na 2 otázky, které už padly. A sice tu od Magdaleny k herbicidům a na tu předchozí o tom přechodu. Já si myslím, že v diskusích, aspoň v naší části Evropy, je vlastně největší problém ani ne takto přijmout ty principy regenerativního zemědělství, ale ten přechod od toho konvenčního k tomu regenerativnímu, protože to sebou nese nějaké negativní externality, že po nějakou dobu se sníží výnosy, po nějakou dobu ještě se musí využívat třeba ty herbicidy. A moje otázka je teda, pokud by nám Dale mohl, kterého zdravím, pokud by nám mohl říct zkušenost s tím přechodem z hlediska toho časového rámce, to znamená, jak dlouho to, řekněme, v jejich podmínkách trvá, než se přejde na jako full regenerativ z toho tradičního, jestli je to 3, 5, 10, 15 let. A speciálně mě zajímá právě ta otázka, jak v té přednášce zaznělo, že postupně se ta potřeba využívání herbicidů snižuje a mě zajímá právě ta definice toho postupně. Jak dlouho to trvá, než je to signifikantně menší? Děkuju.
So Dale, this is a follow-up question on the transition. Because like everyone here probably can believe the principles are right. Yeah, so it's kind of, they sound reasonable. So, but how do you do the transition? And the question specifically here is, from your experience, what is the time frame, the time scale, like 2 years, 4 years, 10 years, when you can actually switch from the conventional to kind of something you would call fully regenerative? And there is the second part of the question is, in terms of herbicide use, for example. So does it mean that, for example, after 10 years, I can go with a herbicide, or after 2 years? So what is the time frame for the transition in your eyes?
It varies, obviously. The higher rainfall makes things easier, just as it does in conventional agriculture. You can make that transition easier. The biggest... Now, in my personal situation, when I made the transition myself from conventional agriculture, I was doing full tillage, no cover crops. I began cover crops at the same time I stopped tillage. And so if we have a saying in the U.S. that no-till with no cover is no good. And so the cover crops provide the good soil physical condition that help enable the transition to no-till. But by creating that good soil structure and protecting that soil, and so because without the cover crops, the soil becomes very compact the first 2 or 3 years without tillage. It takes a while to rebuild the soil structure. And so when you do the cover crops and no-till together, it makes the transition easier. And most people say, I would just want to try one or the other first. I'd encourage you to try them together. It does make things easier. It makes the weed control easier. It makes the soil fertility better. It makes planting easier, harvest easier. Everything becomes easier when you do them together. And most people tell me, in my experience, my crop yields went up the very first year. And other people tell me they go a year, maybe 2 of lower yields, and then they begin to climb. but in my experience, first year, best crops the farm has ever seen.
Thank you, Dale. I'll just do a quick recap and check. Vlastně to hlavní sdělení jsem pochopil. On říkal to sdělení no till, no cover, no good, je, že v Americe byl ten no till systém, což je to bez zpracování mechanického, ale když to děláte bez těch pomocných plodin, bez té přikrývky přírodní, tak to nefunguje. No good. A takže vlastně doporučuje, když do toho jdete, začněte to dělat naraz, jak to nespracování, tak ty meziplodiny. A to je ta věc, která vás zásadně urychlí k tomu, abyste, a on říká, teď už já vlastně většinou umím zvýšit výnos v prvním roce, a když nejhorším, tak druhém, třetím, ale prostě je to možné, když to uděláte naraz, tyhle ty dvě operace. Pokud ještě případně šance na poslední urgentní otázku, jinak my už jsme trošku vyběhli, tamhle poslední otázku a ukončíme.
Jsem slyšet? Jo, už jsem slyšet, super. Já bych se rád zeptal, jak ve Spojených státech pracují s aplikací statkových hnojiv, konkrétně kravského hnoje se slámou, a jakou mají zkušenost třeba s úbytkem živin, pokud ten hnůj nezaorají nebo nezapraví. Děkuji.
Takže ještě jednou, jak pracují s kravským hnojem a se slámou a jaký mají zkušenost s úbytkem těch živin, jste říkal? Dale, last question for you is, what's your experience in the US with cow manure and like straw? And if you process it somehow, or if you have any experience with disappearance or leakage of the nutrients, what do you do with cow manure and straw in the US?
Well, the best spreader of cow manure is the cow. When you graze, and one of the advantages of grazing at every opportunity within the crop rotation is an opportunity to turn some of those cover crops, the crop residue, corn stalks, into manure. Manure does more soil improvement than the decay of the plant material that the cow eats. And so grazing is the perfect way to spread that manure at every opportunity. We do have a big feedlot industry. We have unfortunately, a lot of confinement livestock operations that do produce concentrated manure. We found that if that manure is composted, particularly with some high carbon residue like wheat straw or corn stalks or wood chips, that helps stabilize the nutrients so they're less likely to leach. We don't have the free nitrate running around out in the field. And so that provides a much more stable product for spreading so that we don't have the nutrient losses. The cover crops, in combination with a manure application, help prevent any leaching or running off of those crop nutrients, and really helps make, in fact, in some areas, if you spread livestock manure, you have to spread them on a cover crop.
Okay. Dale, thank you very much for your answers. Looking forward to see you possibly later today and have a good time. And já teď přejdu do češtiny. My se teď s Dalem Stricklem lučíme na půl. Já bych chtěl pozvat Václava Kurela a Jiřího Hlinku na pódium. Kde pak je máme?
Dobrý den.
Dobrý den. Protože oni sebou přinášejí kousek Dalea Stricklera, jestli můžete ukázat. Ano, toto není Dale Strickler, toto je... Dale Strickler je živý a zdravý, jak jste viděli, pouze akorát má covid. My jsme zmínili, že Dale Strickler napsal velice úspěšné knihy o zemědělství právě protože se snaží zintegrovat tu praxi a předávat ji srozumitelně. A tady dva pánové můžou za to, že máme český překlad manuálu regenerativního zemědělství od Stricklera, kde kromě toho, že si můžete pustit ty videa, na který vám pošlem odkaz, tak dále dneska bude k dispozici tady ta kniha přeložená do češtiny, takže už asi neumíme udělat více pro to, aby se vám do ruky dostal nějaký manuál, který je opravdu dobrý na špičkové úrovni v češtině, jak začít s přechodem na regenerativní zemědělství. Pánové, prosím vás o symbolický křest a případně přání, jestli můžete vyslovit.
Jestli je možno, jako to je pár slov, protože ta knížka je opravdu olbřímý, omlouvám se, pane Kulo, jestli budeme takové první slovo, je opravdu olbřímý a měla by tomu odpovídat jako to, i ten proslov, ale já se ho pokusím jako to maximálně zkrátit. My, když jsme vlastně vstupovali jako do toho procesu přípravy knihy, což bylo na podzim loňského roku, tak jsme vlastně opravdu jako netušili, nebo jenom jako ta částečně, jako jak významná jako ta publikace to je. A Dale sám jako ta před chvilkou říkal, jako ta, že pro ty, jako ta, kteří se regenerativnímu zemědělství věnují, nebo ty, kteří o tom uvažují, a zároveň i ty, kteří mu zatím nedůvěřují, mají hodně číst. A domníváme se, že s tou otevřeností, jako ta, ale i vlastně s těmi dobrými příklady, ale my příklady, které jako ta nevyšly a které Dale koncentroval do tohleté knížky, tak je to, doufáme, jako jeden z primárních zdrojů oblasti regenerativního zemědělství, který se teď dostává českým i slovenským čtenářům. Za nás, za Valdem Press, jako to moc děkujeme panu Kurelovi za důvěru, děkujeme Jitce Volkové, Marku Pitlíkovi a dalším jako to lidem z Carbonegu, ale v neposlední řadě bych chtěl zdůraznit jako to i přínos jako to pana překladatele Moudrého, jako to bez něhož jako to bychom se nedopracovali tam, kde jsme, tudíž na pódium této slovutné konference.
So I see Dale is there. So Dale, thank you very much for the book.
You're very welcome.
Tak, jestli můžeme, my jsme
Thank you for the translation.
Děkuji za překlad.
Je to teda, asi bychom měli trošku, Václav, jestli byste přiblížil, čím to křtíme vůbec?
Ano, křtíme to živou půdou z kompostéru Johnsonsů z bioreaktoru, která je plná hub a bakterií.
So Dale, your book is going to be christened with compost.
Full of life.
Takže na počest vám, Dale, jako ta i čtenářům, tak to jako ta...
Ať to dobře roste.
Ať to dobře roste, což platí jako ta i pro českou a slovenskou krajinu. My interně jako tu knížku označujeme opravdu za game changer, jako to v oblasti českého zemědělství. Budeme moc rádi, když tato vize bude naplněna.
Děkuji.
Chci se popřát za Carbonek, ať je knížka čtena, ať vás inspiruje, ať se k ní rádi vracíte, ať slouží celému českému slovenskému zemědělství, ať se dostane do knihoven této univerzity i všech dalších do odborných institucí, ať slouží plně svému účelu. Já jsem si s chutí přečetl anglický originál, věřím, že si všichni rádi s chutí přečtete i tento český překlad. Děkuju.
Děkujeme moc krát, pánové.
Díky.
Let it grow.
Děkujeme. Ahoj. Děkujeme.